mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. Joining me today on this episode, and probably another episode after this, is one of our guests from earlier this summer, Fred Roetker, a retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pilot biologist. Those of you that listen to the podcast will remember that we connected with Fred while he was on location up in northern Alberta, I believe it was, conducting the breeding population survey this year. We'll get into a little bit of that, but Fred has many stories and experiences about his time as a pilot biologist flying all across North America and looking at all sorts of waterfowl habitats. And we thought it'd be fantastic to get Fred on a couple of episodes here and tell us about some of the neat stories that he's collected over the years. So that's what we got for you here today. Hope you enjoy it. Fred, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, good to be here.
You know, Fred, the other thing that I'll tell our audience here, if they hear any sirens in the background, ambulance, police, fire department, whatever, or any other kind of weird noises that you normally don't hear on these episodes, it's because we're in New Orleans at our national convention. It is, mid-July? It is quite warm outside. We are inside recording this, but yeah, still a few random noises from all the activity that's going on around here. So if you hear that, that's just part of the experience here with us. Fred, for those that may not have caught that earlier episode, I want to start with you kind of giving a bit of a background on your history in the waterfowl management field, how you came to be a Fish and Wildlife Service pilot biologist, where you worked, where you were stationed along that time. But let's go back even farther than that, kind of for my own benefit. I don't know a whole lot about your personal life prior to you coming to the Fish and Wildlife Service. Where'd you grow up? And then how did you become a Fish and Wildlife Service pilot biologist?
I grew up 30 miles to the east of Havana, Illinois. Got to know Frank Belrose back in the day when I thought that's what a waterfowl biologist is. I was blessed with some of that. A friend of mine, Vic Hammer, who went on to be a site manager in Illinois in a waterfowl area. But the two of us growing up in a small town of 500 people as seniors, about juniors, seniors in high school, we went down to the state fair in Springfield, and in the conservation building was always a draw. And George Arthur, famous state biologist, and he was my first mentor. But anyway, George was working the booth that day in the conservation, and he kind of had a reputation, a couple kids, how you doing, all that. But we walked up, and he said, "Where are you kids from?" We said, Emden, Illinois. And it was, back in the day, it was famous for its pheasant hunting. I mean, it's no commercial or anything, but just people knew that was in the heart of the pheasant range. And so that was automatically our kind of in. But as we talked, and he said, "You guys hunt doe?" "Oh, yes, sir." And we asked him, "We understand we're going to get the point system this year." And he said, "Really? You guys know about that?" Two kids from Emden. And anyway, in the next breath or two, he said, "Hey, you guys like to go to Saskatchewan and ban ducks for us?" I wouldn't be here talking to you had that conversation not took place. But that set the key, and to jump ahead to your question, we were lucky to band with flyway biologists, and that's where I first met Art Brazda, the first airplane ride in a service airplane, going into the bush to band in the boreal forest. So that's how it all got started.
And when did you start with the Fish and Wildlife Service?
In 84.
84. You were stationed where?
Out to Patuxent. I was living in Illinois on the Mississippi River to Quokka, Illinois, with the Illinois Department of Conservation with the waterfowl program there. And then when I kind of waited for that job, and when an opportunity came, we moved out to Patuxent. and I found a place to live over on the Eastern Shore, and spent 2 years there.
We've had other people on the podcast talking about their experience, their moment of revelation where they realized that, hey, I could have a career in waterfowl ecology or waterfowl management, but a pilot biologist. When did you kind of put that together in that not only could you have a career in wildlife, waterfowl management, but that you could pair it up with being a pilot? Were you interested in aviation prior to kind of coming to the Fish and Wildlife Service? How did all that develop?
Not till I rode in that de Havilland Beaver with Art Brest on a banding assignment. We had banded, Vic and I had banded a couple years after that first year. They hired us back all the way through college to come every summer. So about the second year of that, Morton Smith, Louisiana native, who was head of the program at that time, they were scrambling at the end. Typically banding, it gets better as the month drags on. We're talking summer banding here in August, but as the weather starts to cool off, and sometimes if it's been hot, the ducks don't come to the bait, and you get that last little push. And Art Brasda was banding at a place called Swan Lake north of Orange. And anyway, Mort came down in the 180 where we were banding at Last Mountain Lake, and he said, we got a proposal for you guys. Do you want to go back to school right away, or could you miss 2 or 3 days and go help us up in the Boreal Forest? And he said, I'll fly you in our 180, and then you'll be with Brasda and the Beaver, and that's where it all got started.
But now you weren't an employee of Fish and Wildlife Service.
No, I was
you were still a teenager?
Still a junior. No, I was junior in college.
Okay.
And and I came back and enrolled at Southern Illinois University. And this don't even sound correct anymore, but for $600, you could get your private pilot's license through the university.
Okay.
So Doc Klimstra was my advisor back then. So Klimstra said, you better go for that.
Yeah.
He knew I wasn't graduate school material. Anyway, but instead, the quote Doc, he said, you found your niche. You know, you could go on to graduate school, but this looks like it'll pay off in the end. I encourage you to go that direction. It's all worked out.
Fred, that's a great point, just sort of for, I guess, tangential discussion here, or just to mention, finding your niche is so important. There's not necessarily there's not necessarily a single path that a person takes to be a successful contributor to the waterfowl wildlife management field. I don't know that I would say that you wouldn't have been graduate material, but the point is that there's more than one route to become a successful waterfowl manager, wildlife manager, than through, let's just say, grad school, or whether it be master's or PhD, whatever. I mean, and this is a great example of that. Here, it is a incredibly important role within the Fish and Wildlife Service, within all of our natural resource agencies, and the role of aviation in those. And I think that's just a good point to make, that finding your niche, however the path is that you got there, is really, really important. And you certainly found yours, and you were a tremendous contributor. And I will also extend those remarks, all of your comrades, all of your fellow aviators, your fellow pilots through the years. We have an opportunity here. You and I are friends. You're here in New Orleans, and you're a great storyteller too. I know a lot of your other friends are great storytellers as well, but this is a great opportunity for us to connect with someone like yourself and to share some of the stories that all of your pilot colleagues in the Fish and Wildlife Service and elsewhere could also share. And so I try to do that, is just kind of pay homage, pay respects to everybody else that you're kind of representing in this conversation and all the work that you're doing. So, with that kind of being said, I guess I wanted to move on and sort of talk about some of your first times as a pilot. You got your pilot license, went to work for the service. What were you doing right out of the gate? Were you on waterfowl surveys from the very start?
The program was reduced some with retirees and people doing it. Anyway, when I got hired, they hired Jim Walter from Arkansas. He was the waterfowl biologist in Arkansas, no stranger at all to the duck world, and he had been flying a few surveys there. I wasn't in an aviation position with Illinois, but I was in the waterfowl program in Illinois and doing some hobby flying. I got to tell this story real quick. Don Roosh, legendary goose biologist. Before after the banding that we talked about, I was still floating around after undergrad, and I was doing some aviation work, flying for some aerial photo companies and whatnot. But I was still banding geese for the state of Illinois, especially out of wintertime banding and all, and living on Union County Refuge in southern Illinois. But the Mississippi Flyway Tech meeting was in Evansville, Indiana, and I as a technician, went up with George Arthur and the others that were. Anyway, I met Don for the first time. I've sat in on a Mississippi Valley population of Canada geese. The EPP is out in Missouri, and Iowa. But anyway, Don, I was sat in one of his meetings, and he was the famous researcher up on Hudson Bay Coast near Churchill. And I'm sitting there in that meeting. He said, "Boy, what we wouldn't give to have an airplane in camp." The commercial operators, the smallest thing they got is a single otter. Costs a lot of money. We don't need that much airplane. Like to survey geese. We'll do some surveys almost weekly, and we're just getting our stuff back and forth, and it really cripples us. So after the meeting, I almost ran to him, and I said, "Look, Don, I'm introduced myself. I got about this much time, 600-700 hours. What can we?" And he said, "Let's go have coffee." And anyway, that led to
a lot of decisions have been made over a cup of coffee,
or a glass of beer.
That's true.
But anyway, it all came together, and I found myself with a Cessna 150. We modified. It's a two-place airplane. It's a trainer, and not really quite the bush plane, but it was adequate to do what we needed to do up there to head. We didn't have to go far, working in a limited area out there on the Hudson Bay coast. But that was a big jump in my career to kind of set the stage to get the flyway biologist job.
And so then from Patuxent, when did you come to Lafayette? Was that your next stop, or was there somewhere intermediate in between there?
No, all these other things happened prior to being hired by Fish and Wildlife in a permanent position flying. And so Jim Walter and I came to work out at Patuxent, and I was there 2 years and moved to Lafayette.
Okay, so then you were in Lafayette for the majority of your career, and we're going to get into a lot of the waterfowl discussion here in just a moment. Was there, because I think that's where you spent the majority of your time, was on waterfowl surveys. Is that fair?
Yeah, this is the migratory bird program.
Okay. Yeah.
And there was, at the end, there was some seabird stuff. I mean, there's still waterfowl, but actually the seabird stuff was some for wind energy on the East Coast, but 90+% of it was pure ducks and geese.
Yeah, and they're still doing some of those surveys in the Gulf and along the Atlantic coast associated with some of that wind energy question, right? I think some of the folks,
right.
I forget what we call that. But anyway, they're still flying some of those areas.
Yeah, AMAPs.
I
can't call the whole acronym now, but that's it.
So the other night, I guess it was last night, we were out at dinner, and we were kind of going around the table doing introductions, and got to you, and you introduced yourself as a pilot biologist, retired pilot biologist, and a few other things. And then Dr. Tom Mormon, our former chief scientist, chimed in and added that you have probably seen more waterfowl habitat across North America than any other person. I can't say necessarily any other person on the continent, because there's a group of people that fall into the category that you're in terms of those pilot biologists that have flown waterfowl habitats from the Arctic all the way down through Mexico. But certainly more waterfowl habitats than anybody that's at this national convention right now. I feel pretty safe saying that, and given the scale that you've the places and length of time over which you've done, there's just no doubt about that. So I want you to talk some stories here. I don't know if you're going to have this. I should have asked it beforehand so that you could do a little bit of mental math. Do you have any idea how many miles you have flown doing your waterfowl surveys over the years?
Yeah, I worked that up one time for the Air Venture at we used to display our aircraft at the biggest aviation convention, Oshkosh Air Venture in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. One of the best PR events I ever worked back was when what was it? Prior to the
Great Outdoors Expo.
The Great Outdoors Expo, but it was on the airport. We could bring the airplane in, and it was really good interface with all the duck hunters, but going forward from that, we actually showed the aircraft in a conservation role. That was our deal. Back when we were doing the air show or the displaying our aircraft at some of the aviation things, and that tied into the 50th anniversary of this whole program. So along those lines, the numbers are escaping me now, but there's about 80,000 miles of linear miles in the BPOP survey, the Breeding Habitat Survey.
It's total, okay.
Yeah. So there's about 8 of us most years that are doing those surveys, plus 2 guys in Alaska, guys and gals. And but when you divide all that up, when you do the math, I figured out how many surveys it'd take to get to the moon and back, but that escapes me now.
But if I were to do the quick math there, you said 80,000 miles, you had about 10 crews, so that's 10,000 miles of crew. Doing that right?
Something like that. Yeah, that might be a little
so 300,000 miles, something like that. And then, of course, you did a lot of other surveys as well. I know you flew the Redhead surveys down along the Gulf Coast for a number of years. You flew the Midwinter surveys as well, right? And you probably were involved in some research along the way as well. So probably getting close to 500,000 miles. Does that sound fair?
Probably, yeah.
It's got to be getting close to that, and you didn't get a single frequent flyer mile for that, did you?
Well, we'd leave the airplane here and there and ride the airlines back and forth.
I was mentioning to somebody that I was going to ask you that question, and then they said, well, the follow-up question that you need to ask is that if you were to take every fish that you caught during your downtime across all those years and line them up, front to back, how long would that line be?
Well,
and that there is some truth to that in terms of kind of what you do in your downtime and some of where you are up in those remote locations. We're going to talk about that, and you're in the boreal forest of Canada. You're in a float plane. You have to find a place to land, and where is it? It's a lake, and what's there? You have to have a place to stay, and it's a lodge, and you have to take some time off. So what's any outdoors person going to do? They're going to do a little bit of fishing. There's nothing wrong with that.
The outfitters were really good to us over the years, and it made a lot of sense. Instead of flying, and when you're working in the boreal forest, the towns and the gas pumps are a long way apart. And we'd fuel in the middle of the day and then go out and fly again. I figured it up just before this podcast. I think there was one year that at the end of the survey, the farthest we ever ferried for lodging was 17 miles off the survey line.
Oh, wow.
And we had camped sometimes on the survey line. I saw a Sandy Point one time. I said, there's got to be pickerel right there, walleye for...
So you developed search images
but anyway,
not only for ducks, but for fish
we said we had planned to camp that night anyway, and I'd been watching, and I said, this is our spot. And we heeled the airplane in, and then we continued to camp there. The hunch was right, and we continued to camp there for 4 or 5 years after that. But back to... staying with lodges and outfitters. The deal is if you went to the end of the line, ferried to town, a lot of times, let's use Kenora in Ontario for an example. The airport's quite a little ride into town, wait for the cab, pay the cab fare, go into town, check in, walk around to get a meal, whatever. When you're 17 miles or less from the guy's dock, we land a float plane. They're glad to see us. We're glad to see them. They called us the moccasin telegraph. They said, "Hey, were you guys?" After we got to know the people a year or two, where'd you just come out of? Where did you stay with our buddies down at such and such a lake? Yeah, we heard they bought some new boats this year, and so it was all fun to compare notes with everybody.
So, Fred, we've covered a little bit of the background there. I think what I want to do now is get into some favorite memories, give people a flavor of some of the things that you did, some of the things that you saw, what you looked forward to every year whenever you were going up there, because you flew these surveys. You were one of those 8 pilots. No, what did you say?
8 to 10. It depends on a year.
Pilots in those crews that went up there every year, flew these surveys, counted ducks. You counted ducks as you were also piloting, and you're going at, for those that don't remember, it's like you're 120, 150 feet above
100 to
above
150, but 150 is our target.
And looking out the side of the plane, counting ducks. And so you did this every year for 30 years or so, and it's something that I'm certain you look forward to every year. Do you miss it?
I do.
You did it. You were the observer this year, so that's one thing we'll say.
So
you
it was great
contract.
to be back in the airplane on the right side as an observer, and but yes, it's like.
What do you miss most?
Oh, when it's hot down here in Louisiana, and I told somebody one day, the first year after I retired, I was on Lardo Lake trying to catch sockeye, and this guy got to talking, and he said, "What'd you do for a living?" Retired. He had just retired, and I told him, and I said, "Yeah, I gave up a turbine airplane and go travel in the continent to sit here and watch this little bobber, but I'm enjoying life."
Yeah. Well, I'm happy that you went back this year. We're able to get back and be part of that. We'll talk about that a little bit, maybe later on. Maybe we'll get into that. We've already touched on that a little bit in that earlier episode. But remind people and tell me again, what portions of the survey strata did you primarily survey over your years?
Started my career in southern Manitoba on the prairies, and then we tacked on. Some more people retired and whatnot, and we kind of doubled up on the areas, and I inherited Western Ontario while I was still doing the prairies. So that was other than when I banded back prior to the job with Art Brast and the guys up in the Boreal. Flying the Boreal, I got my feet wet doing Western Ontario. And then after a few years of that, up to northern Saskatchewan and northern Manitoba. Spent most of my career there in the last 80 years or so was up in the Northwest Territories.
Is there a favorite among those?
Yes, there is. I enjoyed some of the stuff we've talked about with the ability to pop in at the outfitters and whatnot. Yeah. Well, it was very remote, but yet there's enough infrastructure and enough that there were more mom and pop camps and all this where we really sometimes are at a loss, like where are we going to end up tonight, because we had choices. In the territories, it's so far flung, and the outfitters tend to be the bigger, really high-end places. And so I just got to know a lot of people. I was there the longest in northern Saskatchewan, and just great people.
Yeah, and when you think about the fact that you're one of a small percentage of people worldwide that have seen that much of such a remote landscape, and largely, relatively speaking, untouched landscape, able to see it so many times and travel tens of thousands of miles across that landscape. I mean, that's got to be pretty cool to look back and say, I was able to do something that I'm certain it's a fraction of 1% of people on this planet have been able to do. I know it would be. I mean, that's got to be pretty cool.
I never got tired of just looking out the airplane window, looking at waterfowl. I mean, seeing the habitat and getting to see some of the major, the really cool waterfowl production areas on this continent, whether it's the prairies, and then you get up in the north, like we talked about when we did the episode from
Fort Chippewa.
Right, with that
Peace
delta.
Athabasca Delta.
That's it.
Right, okay.
So there's more. That one is a favorite, but the Saskatchewan River Delta at Tapal, Manitoba, the Mackenzie Delta at the Arctic Ocean, where the Mackenzie dumps in between Inuvik and then Tuktoyaktuk right on the coast. But just to see all that and see it in different light and different years and all, and the ice up there this year was kind of of incredible.
Yeah.
But no, it was a good ride.
It's one thing to visit the prairies. There's grid roads, 1 mile grid roads all over that landscape. It's kind of all chopped up, in terms of that aspect of it. And you can see a lot of it. And of course, a lot of it has changed. There's tremendous agricultural conversion up there. So you can't really see what it might have been like pre-settlement. But there are a lot of places in the boreal forest that are largely untouched in that regard, right?
Still.
And you're able to see that. That's got to be awesome. I'm really envious. And it's not like you're flying over it at 35,000 feet. You're 100, 150 feet, and you're landing and you're spending an evening in so many of these different locations. What did you look forward to the most? What were you like? You would see, I'm sure you saw a lot of unique types of wild animals, caught a lot of different types of fish. What did you look forward to the most whenever you were going up on those? I mean, you obviously, let's make no doubt, you had a job to do. Mm-hmm. That was first and foremost. You always did that. But you're also an outdoorsman. You love fish, wildlife, the habitats. What did you look forward to the most, and what were some of your favorite experiences in terms of seeing something that you never thought you would?
Yeah, I got to say the people in those environments. I mean, we had. Back to banding, besides the surveys, we used the airplanes to get around, and I got to give a shout out for Jesse and Simone Clausen in Big River, Saskatchewan. Okay. I hope
they're listening.
Yeah, we'll make sure that they get it. Yeah,
good.
But anyway, the first year that I was banding there, we had an incredibly good day at Spiritwood, Saskatchewan, and I brought my crew back to Big River. They had come down and helped because we were just knocking it out of the park on the provincial bait pads, banding mowers. That's another story. But anyway, it was getting a little darkish, but Jesse, a float plane pilot on Delaware Lake, he saw us land, and he got in a pickup truck and his buddy, and I think they were maybe having a rye, and he says, let's go up there and see. And I'll never forget.
They didn't know what y'all were doing there?
No, okay. He just saw an airplane land on, quote, wow, his lake. Yeah. And I'll never forget the first I was tying the tail, and the first thing out of his mouth, it's Americans yet. He saw that N number on that airplane, like, who are you? What are you guys doing? And it was a little bit like, don't you know, it's kind of like civil twilight right now. Anyway, he said, you better come down to the house some 4 or 5 miles, because we had a vehicle there at our camp where we were staying. Anyway, we drive down to the house, and we've been good friends ever since. And yeah, and but the story with that is he had a trapper's cabin about 70 miles north of his home on the lake, and then way up in the far north, just a few miles from the territories line, he had another camp that he was involved in. So our joke was we could fly this whole survey out of Jesse's camps. But we got to see him this year. Garrett and I stopped there on the way to the territories, and they're doing well. And just...
How many people do you have like that you would sort of repeat stops? Because I suspect there was a little bit of variation based on when you, like the timing of the survey, how much you were able to do, or did you have like, I don't know, a dozen places that consistently you stopped at?
No, it varied, and it depended the year and how the ice broke, how things broke up. The difference between flying in the boreal and flying on the prairies is the prairie crews march to the beat of their air-ground comparison people, because they have to coordinate. The good news in the north, we'd played a weather system. Let's use La Ronge, Saskatchewan as an example. Sits in the middle of the province. So if there's a system coming in from the west, and you're aware of that, you go east the day before it, get back, and then let the system pass overnight, and then you go west the next day, where the guys on the prairie is like, oh, we got to do this air ground because the ground crew is in that area, and they can't move around like we do in the airplanes. So we had some discretion on how we flew the order.
When you're flying the Boreal, you had to have a float plane, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there was really no other option than that.
That's the best option.
Okay. But on the Prairie Cruise and some of those others where they have a lot of sort of terrestrial airports, are they all float planes?
No,
or is
not so much.
Okay.
Because the key down there, you got so many municipal airports. Some of them are sod.
Yeah.
And Phil Thorpe, one of my good friends that still flies that, he's collecting, just like we did in the bush with the outfitters. He's got kind of a log of all the various small airstrips he's landed at in Saskatchewan. So he's flying a Kodiak on big wheels right now. So that's another aspect. The guys that are working have just got back from mountain flying training. There's lots of diversity, and I have to say it's safety first.
Yep.
And they've got the equipment to do this job right.
Yeah, well, and in this field, in the field of wildlife management, aerial surveys are the most dangerous part of it. It's one of the reasons why this profession is one of the most dangerous out there, and among some of the things that we're familiar with. It's because of the risk that you take anytime you get up in the plane. And you've done hundreds of thousands of miles in that regard, and it's pretty. Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I wish that I had the opportunity to experience all that you did. So related to the fact that you've landed at all these different locations, municipal airports, sod airport, whatever the case may be, and then some of the lakes where you've landed on. You were telling me last night that there's some of these places where you get to know the air traffic control person, right? And so you swing by and you say hello to them. And tell me about some of that, some of the people that you've met that help you out with some of those logistics. You've talked about some up in the Boreal where you're able to stay, but some of the other people, the fuel and all the type of coordination that has to occur with that, just some of those stories of your interaction with the people that make this possible.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is for the people listening, is many of them may follow some of the Fish and Wildlife Service's web pages, but there is a page, and I don't have the address right here, but that tells it's a blog, and I have to mention what Walt Rhodes. We were talking about some at dinner last night with his buddies from South Carolina. Walt's now out in Bend, Oregon, but he's part of his history. He's an outdoor writer, and we always love his blogs. And he started it out like his first contact with ATC, air traffic control in La Ronge, Saskatchewan, was it's 754, whatever he was flying. Most of the airplanes have a 3-digit number, and it's the 700 series. So a lot of people know who we are. But anyway, the 2 years of COVID, there wasn't a survey, and Walt just nonchalantly, hey, La Ronge, it's just 754. We're 10 miles south, inbound landing, and the guy came back, and this is all in the blog.
Yeah,
the guy came back and gave him, like the winds are out of whichever direction, in the altimeter setting. Walt, is that you? Welcome back. So anyway, there's a lot of stories like that.
Yeah.
Here's a great one. We were sitting on the ramp waiting to take off in Regina, Saskatchewan one time, and the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police caravan, was in line behind us for takeoff, and he is pretty laid back on the prairies there. Anyway, when they cleared us to go or whatever, he picked up his mic and said to the tower, he said, "What a harbinger of spring! The duck guys are back." And
I never thought of that.
But anyway, we kind of enjoyed that.
That's funny. Now, so that kind of brings me to another point, and I know you shared at least one story about this with me just last night. You go to a lot of places, you see a lot of different people. A lot of these people you meet for the first time, they ask you what you're doing. Number one, especially when you're in Canada, this is a U.S. government plane in Canadian airspace. I mean, that's sort of that's a bit unusual. So you get a lot of questions about that. But then, invariably it's like, what are you doing here? Tell me about what this is. What were some of the most interesting responses that you got whenever you told them that you're counting ducks?
Yeah, but like, who cares? and we tell them like, hey, this is, and first of all, the sportsmen all understand this. We interface with a lot of guys getting on float planes to go up to the lodge, but people out and about, you're counting, I'll take it back down here to, I think the story last night was here in the States,
okay,
where you're somewhere and talking to pilots in the area. And what do? You're counting. They when we got into the turbine airplanes, a lot of the guys said, "What are you guys doing with this?" Well, we're doing duck counts and whatnot, waterfowl surveys. Really? Like, why? And so there's a lot of times this would be a younger crew member, right seat position, and the captain with more experience has been around in the charter world. He'd say, look, you're going to go to places like Stuttgart, Arkansas, and Easton, Maryland in your career, because that's where, he said, ducks are a big deal. And the people listening to this podcast already know that, most of them. And but it's the story we were telling is, look at the ramp in Stuttgart, Arkansas. The parking area during the opening weekend of duck season is who's who in aviation. The Gulf Streams, you name it, is parked at Stuttgart. And so in the aviation world, crew members are Sierra Golf Tango, Stuttgart, Arkansas. They all know where that is.
Oh, really? What is it again?
Sierra Golf Tango is the identifier for the Carl Humphrey Airport in Stuttgart, Arkansas.
Fred, we have a lot more to talk about, because I still want to ask you about some of your most interesting observations, non-duck related, whenever you were up in the Northwest Territories or anywhere. And also want to talk to you about kind of your observations of how things have changed. What are some of the more notable things that you've observed? And then also want to talk to you about some of your work down in Mexico. You flew a lot of surveys down there as well, and I know you have some stories there. And probably also, I just want to hear some of the like most memorable, most scary, most uncertain, any of those types of things, that we want to get into here on the next episode. But we'll close this one out, and we'll have you back. We'll resume here on our next episode and talk more about all the great work that you've done as a pilot biologist for the service, and then of course everything else that all your other comrades, your colleagues, pilot biologists have done. Thank you for all that, Fred. Thank you for being here on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Fred Roetker, retired pilot biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We appreciate all of his time through the years. We appreciate him sharing it here and sharing some of the stories of what that so unique position brings to this profession. As always, we thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for the great job he does with these podcasts, and we thank you, the listener, for your time and spending it with us, and for your support of wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks. Stay tuned to the ducks. Stay tuned to the ducks.